Hello and welcome to this special broadcast, this live broadcast from our Farm Journal studios in South Bend, Indiana. I'm Clinton Griffiths, coming to you with an update on the situation between Russia and Ukraine and its impacts on agriculture and our agricultural markets. We've got a host of guests today. Let's go ahead and bring in Joe Vaclavik with Standard Grain. Joe, as we look at the market action today, we've seen some significant moves in our grains, in oil, in the stock market. What's your read on how our markets have reacted to this news today?
Well, the market's very clearly reacting to what is a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. There's a lot of implications here. The first and immediate one that I think the trade is considering would be any sort of disruption of grain flows out of the Black Sea. Combined account for 29% of all global wheat exports. That's the USDA projection. 16% of global corn exports expected to come from Ukraine also. So big implications there. That may be one of the reasons why you've seen the soybean market act a little bit more. Gains here have peeled back, and we're actually trading lower as we speak here after a higher trade overnight. There's just not that implication. The other things to be concerned with would be fertilizer prices, fuel prices. We know that the crude oil market's off to the races today. A lot of the energies are. Russia's a big energy supplier to Europe. So there's a lot of messy stuff here. And keep this in mind, and I just want to make this clear. Higher grain prices are great, but lives are going to be lost here. War is terrible. This is not a good situation by any stretch.
Joe, as we try to digest all this, have you been surprised by the way that the markets have reacted? It seems like wheat has been the front leader on this.
I'm not surprised by the way the markets have reacted. I'm surprised that this happened at all. I really thought, and I think a lot of people thought, that this was a lot of posturing and political type stuff. But Russia means business here, and Vladimir Putin's a bad man. And this is a messy situation that I don't necessarily know. I don't think it was expected. I mean, you look at the way the markets reacted. I mean, the Dow Jones loses 800 points, wheat rallies 50 cents. I mean, this was not priced into the market.
Joe Vaclavik, Standard Grain. Hey, Joe, thank you so much for jumping on today and giving us some perspective of what's been going on. Why don't we go ahead and bring in Dan Basse with AgResource Company. Dan, as you look at this situation and these markets are unfolding and the entire world is watching what's happening in Ukraine as Russia went in this morning, made a very strategic, calculated strikes all at once, moved swiftly into place. What's your reaction to how this could impact agriculture long term?
Well, it is a structural change, and like Joe, I reflect upon this is not the way we need to get a bull market. We need to get bull markets through demand, and unfortunately, we will see some of that Black Sea demand shifting here. This is a realignment of global ag trade flows, and so we are looking at whether it be barley, corn, wheat, vegetable oils. That is what the Black Sea exported, and that's now coming to different countries. And because of the South American dryness, it's amplified in terms of the United States. The U.S. farmer has a much more important role now in feeding the world. And so the weather coming up in the upcoming growing season will be dynamic, and the volatility in these markets will be something to witness almost on a daily basis. Today, we traded $1 range in soybeans and Minneapolis wheat. Corn is traded somewhere in the vicinity of 40, 50 cents. These are what we should expect going forward. So strap yourself down. All of us will need a seatbelt in these markets going forward.
Dan, as we obviously are trying to get a grasp on what this ultimately will mean to trade flows around the world. There's talk that those ports could see significant reductions or close. If that happens, how big of an impact does that have?
Well, it's important, but we don't know exactly what the sanctions will be from the Biden administration and the remainder of the world, and if ag products will be targeted. We also don't know is if the Russians come back, let's say the Russians, due to their military prowess, are able to do what many experts expect, which is taking over Ukraine. After that, what will the Russians and Ukrainians do? And some of us are wondering if they won't just drop their price to see if they can buy back their market share. We'll see how that all comes to bear, but this is where the importance of naval blockades and a lot of those other things come forward. But it's something we'll all be watching. But it really falls into that volatility category again of how does the Western world combat maybe Ukraine and Russia dropping price and fulfilling Chinese demand. There's still 15 million metric tons of Ukrainian corn that has to be exported this growing season. China's about half of that. Will China get its corn? That's the key question down the road.
You know, Dan, we haven't heard much out of China, basically choosing to stay out of it at this point. Does that surprise you? Is that expected?
Well, if I go back and remember the coziness that came between President Putin and President Xi at the Olympics, and we all thought that maybe something would conspire after the Olympics, it seems to me that there was some ordainedness to this Russian intrusion into Ukraine, invasion maybe, which is the right way to say it today. But as you think forward, you know, some of us are now worried about, well, what is the Chinese going to do? I mean, if Putin is able to dance into Russia this quickly, this effectively, without the resistance that they had, you know, and the Western world is only throwing on sanctions, what will happen in terms of Taiwan is in play for our friends in China? So something to watch, and the reactions in the market would be diametrically different. It's bullish, losing the world's largest wheat exporter and third largest wheat exporter in terms of Russia in Ukraine. The world's largest buyer is China, and we were to lose that market, the ramifications would be bearish. So keep your eyes wide open. There's lots of geopolitical play here, and this is something important as we think about the coming weeks and months.
Dan, do you think sanctions have a big impact here, or is this going to be a stronger stand? I mean, obviously we're waiting on the White House to come out and make some statements here. We expect the president at any point to come out and talk to the American people. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's very rare historically that sanctions are used in terms of food supplies. And so it's a leap of the Western world if we start looking at food supplies being constrained out of the Black Sea. We don't know yet because those announcements haven't come forward. But if, of course, there is an embargo per se, or de facto embargo of Russian and Ukrainian grain because of new ownership in the state of Ukraine, that would be important. The question is always one of how do we monitor, how do we apply? And we had the same kind of issues in Iran with crude oil. Somehow leakages always occur, and it's always due to price. Someone's willing to take more risk going forward. So we'll see how it all comes to bear. But, you know, again, the realignment of world trade is important. We are rather optimistic now on U.S. corn exports, probably from March through the end of summer. We'll see how soybeans play out, but a lot of that depends on South American supplies, which are still being determined.
How big of an issue is the price of crude oil at this point? We did see some solid moves up above that $100 per barrel mark overnight and earlier today, but that seems to have pulled back some. Is that a significant move? Do we expect more of that? And obviously that adds a little inflationary pressure to our overall economy.
It sure does, Clinton. As you think about it, Russia is the third largest crude supplier to United States that we need with light sweet crude. So, you know, losing that, if indeed we decide to embargo Russian crude oil, is going to have big ramifications for the U.S. market. Some of our modeling would indicate that crude oil could then push up closer to 110 or 115, another 10 or 15% increase in value of crude, which would then trickle back in terms of gasoline and diesel prices. Fertilizer is going to be also impacted in terms of will we embargo fertilizer from Russia and Ukraine, and how does that all play out? Of course, Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, just got back from Russia trying to plead for their supplies in September. We'll see if that basically happens, but you somehow wondered if maybe Bolsonaro wasn't also talking about agricultural supplies and the importance of Brazil going forward. All of this is still kind of a play in action. In other words, we don't know all the parts and pieces, but as we get policy that comes forward from the Biden administration and from NATO members, we should be to better understand what our availability of both energy and fertilizer will be. But today, I think the market will take this dim view that supplies are going to be limited as we really try to shut down the Russian economy and inflict harm from an economic perspective.
You know, Dan, all of this happening with the backdrop of the Ag Outlook Forum taking place today in Washington, D.C. We came out with some acreage estimates here in the U.S., 88 million acres for soybeans, 90 million acres for corn, 48 million for wheat. What is your read on those, and do they have, is there any long-term tail here, any tail from what's happening in Russia and what these acres ultimately will be?
Well, I feel a little bit for the WASDE analysts that had to come out with the estimates today. Of course, this happened overnight, so when they released their estimates, there was no windage of, let's say, an invasion of Ukraine in these estimates. Moreover, they probably utilize the South American estimates from WASDE back in the middle of February. So a 134 Brazilian soybean crop, which we fear may be closer to 122 and under. As you think about that going forward, it does translate into better U.S. export demand, both in corn, soybeans, and wheat. The U.S. farmer is in this position of needing to produce as much as he can. We would imagine that stocks will be relatively tight in the year ahead. With that, USDA probably will be cutting their end stocks estimates. I don't think the market's thinking about a 1.9 billion bushel corn end stock number or a $5 cash price. More importantly, I think there's a lot of us that have corn end stocks at about 1.1 billion and soybean end stocks because of South American losses closer to 100 or 125 million, basically pipelines. So this is where the importance comes forward. The USDA is projecting a record large corn yield of 181 bushels an acre. That compares to last year's 177. Historically rare is to get back-to-back record U.S. corn yields. In fact, since the hybrid seed days, it very rarely has happened since the 1960s.
Well, it will be something to watch. Obviously, we're continuing to keep an eye on all of these things. We know that we'll be getting more information on both, our acreage estimates and our production in the coming weeks. Plus, as we watch what's unfolding in the Ukraine with Russia and the way the rest of the world reacts to that, obviously there's a lot more information to process in the hours and days ahead. Dan, thank you so much for joining us here on this special live broadcast here on AgWeb.com. We appreciate you being here. We also appreciate Joe Vaclavik. We had a little bit of a hard time getting Sam Taylor with Rabobank to get connected in with us, but we'll get his comments separately and put those up as well. It's just a dynamic and moving situation. Of course, we'll continue to follow it along both on air and online. We appreciate all of you taking a few minutes to get up to date on today's historic events. We'll be talking to you again soon. Have a great one.